He was his mother's secret, and the house knew it before anyone said it aloud. Santa Vitória had the private habits of a thing that keeps itself together by ritual. Waxed floors that shone like patience, galleries that trapped heat until the evening glass sweated, the perpetual faint of coffee drying on the yard like an incense that would not quit. Jasmine climbed the rear wall and pressed its fragrance into the seams of the windows. At dusk, the flower's sweetness seemed to lull conscience as much as servants. Doors there were more than apertures. They were thresholds where relationships were measured. Who could cross, who must wait on the other side? Which hands were permitted to close and which only to knock? Eleonora de Albuquerque moved through those thresholds with the exactitude that comes of long practice. Widow at 45, widow by inheritance and social expectation, she wore the house's decorum as one wears a formal dress, tight, considered, never careless. In public she was the image of restraint, the powdered widow who kept to her parlor and her ledger, who entertained only in restrained, tasteful intervals. But the house had rooms that belonged to dusk, and in those rooms Eleonora kept a lighter that the ledger could not account for. The ledger recorded land, coffers, sales. It did not record the empty seconds of a bed at night, the thirst of a body that had learned to mourn in more than one way. Tomás lived in the world that made nothing private by right. He was of the plantation, a presence woven into the routine of Santa Vitória, long before Eleonora had thought to summon him after the candles were guttering. His hands carried the memory of the coffee trees, the long bend of harvest, the callus of palms, a touch that knew both the pulp and the pattern of the land. He had been trained to a neat competence that marked him as valuable. This value had a price that others paid, and he was not asked to name. He spoke little where speech was taxed, observing the household as if it were a machine whose gears sometimes cracked, and one must tend them silently. The beginning, for those who tell such things as if they had reason and schedule, was on a night when the air inside the house felt like a warmed stone. Rain had not come for weeks, and the heat made people small and sharp with longing. Eleonora sent for Tomás on an impulse that had the quality of a thing that has waited its chance and found it. The messenger who went by the back stairs said only, "Madame calls for Tomás," and Tomás, who had been finishing the last of the pots in the cookhouse, felt the summons like a hand on the nape of the neck, equal parts command and something he could not refuse and did not wish to resist. It is necessary to say, without softening consequence, that the summons came from power. A woman could summon an enslaved man, and the household accepted the summons as a form of authority. To describe what followed as if it were a mutual arrangement in any moral equal sense would be to shave away the cutting edges that defined every moment between them. Tomás knew that the night would be judged differently, depending on who looked. He knew what his presence there would mean to the ledger of reputations and the ledger of souls in those rooms. He also knew, with the small stubbornness that humans possess when they must find agency inside cages, that absence is sometimes the only true possession. To refuse entirely would be to invite a shape of punishment or ostracism, less visible perhaps than lash and more persistent in indignity. To yield without reservation would be to consent to being redrafted as something smaller than he considered himself. So he came. They met in a room that smelled of jasmine and old paper. Eleonora stood by the window with the night-pressing glass against her wrists as if to test them. She had a handkerchief in one hand, as though she might have to betray a tear, or as if to hide the small tremor of desire she had long convinced herself did not belong to her. Their first encounters were not thunderous confessions, but a series of careful approximations. A chair drawn close, the quieting of breath, the touching of a sleeve where a cuff had been loosened. The story that would become scandal in later retellings began in deliberate gestures, hands that sought warmth not so much for heat as for the proof of being attended to. Tomás's touch was practical and particular, the sort born of labor and of knowing what a hand could do that a tongue could not. He attended to Eleonora with a tenderness that was not naive. He knew boundaries. He knew the danger. He knew, too, that hunger took many forms. There was a part of the night when the two of them, in the thin anonymity of closed shutters, made an agreement tacit and solemn, that they would be careful not because of love's gentleness, but because the household's eyes were merciless, and the law of proprietorship would not countenance a scandal for long. Each thing kept its weight: Eleonora's longing, Tomas's restraint, the household's unspoken rules. Afterwards, when he returned to the servants' quarters, and the air grew cooler and the stars were clearer for not having to bear witness, Tomas would look at his hands as if they had done work that required accounting. He would roll the few coins he was allowed to possess, not out of greed but habit, the smaller economies of a man whose life was counted in permissions and in withheld allowances. He told himself in the private language that all constrained men find, that he would keep his dignity intact by keeping control, that whatever tenderness he allowed at the window would be returned to him as a memory, not as a title. There was in him a grave and private humor about being desired by a woman who could call him and no one would protest. He felt insulted and desired in the same breath. The friction of those feelings made him sharp as flint. Months folded into one another. The affair settled into a pattern like the sigh of evening. It was not constant, but recurring at intervals that matched the pulses of loneliness and seasonal surges. Eleonora fed the scandal into the secret places of her heart and kept it there like a candle that she lit on nights. The wind went through the galleries. To the household she remained the composed widow. To Tomas she was, intermittently, someone who asked for more than he offered and less than he would have demanded if he believed in the rightness of such a demand. For both, the arrangement became a mirror each did not wish to fully face. Eleonora saw a version of herself who was less bound by propriety than she admitted. Tomas saw a version of himself reduced and yet strangely seen. When Clarice returned to Santa Vitória at 19, she arrived with the exact arrogance of youth and the brittle glaze of convent schooling. The convent had taught her manners and Latin prayers. It had taught her to think of sin in categories, but it had not taught her to be invisible, to know what it felt like when a life is measured not by its pulses, but by the ledger entries of another generation. Clarice had grown within the constraints of certain decorums and resented them in ways that bloomed into rebellion the moment she stepped back into the house that had raised her. Her re-entry was filmed in small domestic shocks: the way she held her skirts, the new edge in her gaze, the way she measured the servants with a look that was almost hunger. She had the soft cruelty of youth that does not yet understand the cost of cruelty. The first time she saw Tomas outside her mother's bedroom was by accident and then by will. She had been walking the upper gallery at dusk, a place of thresholds, when she saw the door under which a thread of light escaped. The house's rules taught her to be curious, and being curious in that place was for her an invitation. The corridor smelled of wax and coffee and a faint string of jasmine. There was the hush of people waiting for dinner. Clarice's footsteps were measured. She paused by the stair and placed her hand on the banister, watching the small scene below unfold like a play she had not expected to see. Tomas's back was toward her as he emerged from the bedroom. An ordinary exit, the lifting of shoulders, the tilt of his head. He carried himself with a dignity that did not suit the informal role the house had given him. Clarice saw him, and the sight lit a shadow inside her that she had mistaken for rivalry. She had never been jealous of her mother in a way that mattered. That was reserved for the living room when dresses were compared, and for the dowry when it was measured. But seeing Tomas, feeling that he was a secret tether between her mother's private world and the house's public face, woke a different animal. Something that had lived inside the convent's taught certainties as discontent now demanded to be acknowledged. Clarice did not know what she wanted precisely. Most people at 19 mistake the taste of power for the taste of desire. For her, desire arrived parasitically on the back of possession. If her mother could have this, why not she? If a man could be her mother's alone, could a daughter not take him in turn? The first acts of rivalry were small and deliberate. Clarice began to dress in ways that accentuated the differences between herself and the guests her mother kept. Brighter ribbons at the throat, a loosened cuff, a lace that caught the light of a lampshade. She timed her walks through the gardens to coincide with times she guessed Tomas might be passing. She dropped things: an intentionally scattered handkerchief, a tumbling coin. At moments he would stoop to pick them up. Each small stratagem was a test, a homework in observation more than seduction. She was savoring the game, delighting in a power she had only just discovered she possessed. Tomas noticed the attentions because he was obliged to. He had watched women before. He had been used to their calculations. But there was something quick about Clarice's moves, something rawer than courtship. She did not hide her intent under the fineries of flirtation. She toyed like an apprentice testing tools. For him, each of her provocations was another reminder that he was under two kinds of gaze, the polite, protective one of the mistress and the sharp, acquisitive one of the daughter. He had learned to read both. He read them with a sober mind that did not mistake cleverness for care. The household watched the subtle war without naming it. Servants noticed the shift in the parlour's atmosphere, the way Eleonora sometimes lingered by her embroidery, and then let the needle drop. The capataz kept his mouth shut because that was how one survived, keeping the cogs turning without interfering in the affairs that belonged to the meat of the house. The other enslaved men felt the tension like a weather change. A storm might be coming, they whispered. But the storms in Santa Vitória had always been met with roofs repaired and crops tended. This one, some suspected, might strike at the foundations rather than the tiles. In the library, Clarice began to stage a more dangerous experiment. It was a room of thresholds, too, lined with books and dust, its windows open to a yard where the morning humidities rose. Here the rituals were both farcical and serious. A daughter could appear to seek knowledge and instead seek conquest. She found Thomas one afternoon by the shelves, pretending to organize ledgers, practical work that he did with an economy of movement. She stood by the entrance with a coy consternation, and the air between them was a question asked and not answered. "You are always where you should be," she said. The words were light, but they carried a barb. She placed herself closer, letting the hem of her sleeve brush his arm. Thomas did not flinch. He had learned to measure proximity as a thing of survival. He responded with the politeness bequeathed by habit. "I keep what is asked of me, Donna Clarice," he said, using the formal address that marked the distance between them. Clarice's eyes had an animal gleam. She reached out and moved a book from the shelf, as if to show him a title, and the contact was a calculated accident. The gesture happened in a room that smelled of paper and the faint wax of candle trickle. For a heartbeat, things could have shifted. Thomas felt the old temptation of small kindnesses, how they might be turned into something else. He knew the proverb that a man might be tempted by the easy warmth of a single touch, but he also held the ledger of reasons why he must not be easy. The first time she pressed her lips to his, it was in the library near a window that looked out at the yard and the low, indifferent line of the coffee trees. It was not an orchestrated kiss as one imagines in novels. It was the thrust of someone who had been told too often that her desires could not be named. Clarice's mouth was abrupt, insistent. For a span of time that stretched like a held breath, he yielded. No one can say a man never answers a human approach. But it was a yielding informed by calculation, a test, a defense, a way of measuring how far she might go and how he would reply. At that small yielding, something shifted more than either wished to confess. Clarice felt victory in the way a conquest provides an immediate, illusory satisfaction. She believed herself possessed of a power that could turn secrecy into inheritance. Thomas, for a flash, felt what it might mean to be chosen for a tenderness that was not a ledger entry. But then the ledger of his life closed like a book. He drew back, firmly, politely, with a gravity that in other moments might be called gentleness, but here was a refusal sharpened to an edge. "You must not," he said, and the words were quiet but absolute. Clarice's face hardened in surprise, then in something like outrage. "Why?" she demanded, not with reason but with the pride of someone for whom rule had always been a game to be relearned. "Why may she have what I cannot?" He looked at her as if he could carve the difference inside her. "Because I am not what you take," he replied. "Because there are things you have been taught to own that cannot be owned this way." His answer was both a rebuke to her presumption and an assertion of his own claim. For Thomas, the refusal was not only about the girl's impatience, it was about the politics of his own body and soul. To become again a prize would be to surrender the small autonomy he had preserved. In the structure that made him a thing for others to bargain over, he would not be, even for a night, a pawn in a duel between two women. Clarice recoiled as if struck. Her hand flew to her mouth, not in shame but in a new calculation of grievance. Eleonora, from another room or perhaps from the corner of the house's memory, could never have foreseen that the day would come when her daughter's desire would masquerade as a claim to right. The more impetuous Clarisse became, the more peculiar the household's geometry of power looked. It created spaces where ownership and affection were irreconcilable, where a man's interior life could not be reconciled with the world's demands. Thereafter, the acts between mother and daughter folded into a bitter choreography. Eleonora's fear of scandal sharpened into a territorial possessiveness she could not admit even to herself. Clarisse's youthful hunger for claim turned into a will to possess that she practiced on small things before moving to the larger. Thomas watched both as if they were flames, whose heat he must respect lest his shadow be burned. In the stables, Clarisse staged another provocation. She had learned how to handle the horses, the way of leaning a hip against the manger, of speaking animal to creature until a man's ear might be commanded to listen. She found Thomas mucking with a bridle, and made a show of dropping a lace at his feet. "You see?" she said aloud to a horse, but with her eyes on him. The gesture had the cruelty of someone who practices power on the helpless to prove a point to the powerful. Thomas bent and picked up the lace. He offered it, his palms bunched with habits of labor, and she let her fingers brush his in a way that seemed casual but was intended to be read as claim. He repeated the choice he had made in the library, a steady withdrawal into the narrow field of propriety he had been allowed. His politeness was offense. He would not turn aside violence, but neither would he give in to the indulgence of being owned for display. To those who watched, perhaps even to Clarisse herself, this seemed like stubbornness or pride. To Thomas it was daily reckoning. He carried the memory of his mother, and the stories of a life that might be variously denigrated or dignified, and he refused to let an ill-trained girl's appetite reduce him to mere theatre. Eleonora, when she suspected that the daughter had seen, felt a treacherous panic that was a mixture of sibling rivalry and maternal entitlement. She had always nurtured in herself the right to secret consolation. That right now looked as if it might be contested by the blood she had borne. She moved through the house with a new watchful sorrow, threading distance and closeness with the practiced skill of a woman who knew how reputation and want could intersect disastrously. In private, when she sat by the window and felt the night press against the glass, she thought not only of the warmth Thomas had given, but of how thin its tenure had become. The heat that had once been so private now felt like a perilous commodity. The household grew taut, conversations shortened, servants avoided lingering where whispers might collect. The capataz remarked to anyone who would listen that the seasons were restless. The men in the field grumbled about harvests, but their grumbles masked a more private apprehension. There is a way in which a secret, once seen, insists on being reframed. It will either be repressed or it will be dragged into the light. Clarisse, impatient and newly taught to wield small cruelties, chose light. One afternoon, with the sun pressing white on the barn's tiles and the dust rebuking the clarity of the day, she followed Thomas as he made his rounds. She watched him from the shadowed eaves while he worked with a concentration that was almost religious. When he paused to tie a knot, she stepped from the dark and said softly, "Why do you look at me with that look, Thomas? Like I am a thing you are not allowed." He did not answer immediately. His hands moved with the ease of labor, and in that economy of motion there was a language he used to keep himself whole. At last he spoke, and his voice was low. "Because you are young," he said, "and because you have not yet learned the cost of taking." Clarisse's eyes narrowed. The words ignited in her the twin fires of curiosity and offense. "Cost," she repeated, as if the phrase were something learned in a manual she had missed. "Whose cost?" His reply would have, in another tale, been the end of a game. "Yours if you do not learn, mine always." She stepped closer until the heat of his body brushed her arm, an intimacy she used to perform to embarrass him. And for a breath, Thomas imagined a life in which he could call what he desired by its true name and have it answered. He knew the brevity of such daydreams. He knew, too, that the plantation kept lists, of debts, of favors, of misdeeds, and that a man like him existed on the margins of those lists. After that day, the provocations became more explicit. Clarisse arranged to be seen where Thomas would be, let her skirt sweep the floor in the way that suggested more than cleanliness, and let her voice carry remarks that were intended to be overheard. Each move forced a response. From Tomás, a greater reserve. From Eleonora, a sudden serenity that was actually a tightening around the things she wanted to keep. From the household, a slow and careful turning of eyes away from what they suspected might erupt into ruin. The house at Santa Vitória, with all its wax and windows and jasmine, began to feel like a theatre where everyone had forgotten they were actors. The audience, that nebulous community of neighbours and buyers, and the social circles that made the world of land mean something, still imagined propriety. They did not know there was a secret the size of a man threaded into the drawer of curtains at night. It is easy to imagine such a story as a rivalry that resolves itself in melodrama. The daughter triumphs, the mother falls, the servant is sold and the house forgets. But for Tomás, the story was never that neat. He had a sense that the choice would not be forced upon him without a cost, and that his agency, if it was to be exact, must be claimed in a manner that preserved his interior life. He began privately to plan not a rout of either woman, but an exit, some way to remove himself from the geography of possession. Yet plotting an exit in a world where human beings were counted as commodities is not like plotting a route on a map. It requires allies, money, the quiet complicity of those who can look the other way. It requires a moment of courage so precise it becomes indistinguishable from recklessness. For now, though, the triangle tightened. The house listened, and in listening it found its own pulse. Nights became small battlegrounds, a look across a candle, the scraping of a chair leg, a hand that lingered on a teacup. Clarice learned gamesmanship and practiced with ferocity. Eleonora defended her hold with a new ferocity that surprised her as much as it did those who watched. Tomás held his center, retreating at times to the stoic reserve that had kept him alive, measuring out kindness as one would a medicine, sparingly with exact dosage. The chapter closed, if one may call it that, on a day when the harvest was near and the air tasted of dust and ripe fruit. Clarice found Tomás in the library again, this time reading under the high window where the light came in long blades. She slipped into the room and closed the door without sound. He looked up. In that moment, when the world narrowed to the two of them, and the doorway behind her was a thin rectangle of brightness, the house seemed to inhale. Clarice approached with a certainty that had hardened into resolve. She did not say she loved him. She did not have the words. Instead, she reached out and took his hand. For a while, nothing happened, as if the world were testing to see whether any human would break the pattern first. Then, in a motion that seemed both inevitable and tragic, Clarice leaned forward and pressed her mouth to his. The contact was a spark that might have struck a tinder a dozen ways. Tomás, who had yielded once by a calculation and withdrew when principles and survival demanded it, felt something shift inside him. He tasted the young woman's hunger, saw how she tried to cloak public right with private longing. His hands moved as if remembering labor, then paused. He could have given in for perhaps a second, for a gesture that might have saved him the immediate sting of her outrage. But a lifetime of counting consequences and preserving scraps of self rose within him, and he drew back with a firmness that was more command than apology. "You don't understand what you wish to own," he said, and his voice was softer than it had any reason to be for such an utterance. Clarice's face contorted with the first true flash of something that was not triumph but outrage. She stepped back as if the refusal had struck her. Her fingers fluttered where his had been. The library held its breath. The dust motes hung like witnesses. Outside, the coffee trees bent to the wind. Somewhere in the household a bell rang for evening. Inside, on the thread of light that crossed the floor, two people found themselves at the center of a rupture they had both summoned and feared. The house, in its patient way, recorded it all, the touch, the refusal, the small mortal fracture of that late afternoon. The door closed after them like a judgment. For a while the library seemed to hold the echo of the refusal as if it were a living thing, a small sound that did not belong to dust nor to wood, but to the space between people where something had snapped. Clarice, furious and mortified by the rebuke, left with the stride of someone who believes damage can be repaired by a change of posture. Tomás smoothed his hands over the book he had last handled, and with the quiet retraction of a man who has learned the arithmetic of invisibility, walked back to his appointed rounds. The house resumed its habitual noises. the distant clink of cups, the soft shuffle of slippers. Yet none of them could quite mask the fracture. The night that followed was heavy as a kept secret. Illness announced itself with small, traitorous details. Eleonora began to sleep badly. She woke with the taste of iron at the back of her throat and a shiver that the seasoned servants, with the blunt empathy of people who have watched many bodies betray their owners, read as something more than mere weakness. The doctor, a man who came to Santa Vitória, as he came to many houses, carrying a fold of insect-stained casebooks and a pouch of medicinal tinctures, pronounced a fever. He spoke in measured syllables about inflammation and strain, but his voice carried the hesitation of a profession that measured many diseases in terms of prognosis and social cost. In the house, the word fever folded into a dozen private prayers, oracles, and calculations. Clarice found in the illness a new instrument. Fever, for her, became not only a danger, but an opportunity, an occasion in which the moral lines of the house could be redrawn by force or by ruse. She spent hours by her mother's bedside, not with the hand that knows how to soothe, but with the hand that keeps count. She watched Tomas's watchfulness like a hawk that, having tasted blood, refuses to be content with small victories. Eleonora, delirious between nights, sometimes whispered a name or a colour, and the household mistook those murmurs for the inward wandering of the mind. Clarice made of them evidence. The capataz, who had kept his head low throughout matters he did not judge his business to resolve, grew nervous in ways that looked like prudent calculation. He saw that people could be ruined by what they loved and by what they feared. He avoided clear counsel, but cleared the way for the doctor, for the maid, for the steward. The servants moved in quiet circles around Eleonora's bed. Tomas, when he was asked to fetch a cooling cloth or to steady a cup, performed his tasks with a precise tenderness that was not sentimental. It was careful because it had to be. Each of his small ministrations stuck in his hands like a mark. One night Eleonora woke from a fever dream, and with a clarity that frightened those watching, called for Tomas by name. Her voice was thin and urgent. It carried the old imperiousness of a woman who had practiced being obeyed to the point of forgetting she had once been a crowd among many. Tomas came because he came to the summons of the house, because there are calls a person learns to answer in order to keep a precarious equilibrium. He sat by her bed and took her hand. It was in the way of small practical kindnesses, the moistening of a lip, the adjustment of a pillow, but there was also a longer history in that touch. Nights, windows closed, jasmine pressed between panes. Eleonora's fingers tightened around his, like someone trying to preserve a thing that would not be sustained by the next breath. Clarice watched and misread the meaning of every contracted tendon. "Stay," she ordered, too loud for a room full of curtains and too small for speech that wanted to be law. "Stay with us. Choose us, and be done with this pretending." Tomas leaned back from the bed as if he had been physically struck. The light in the room turned oily with heat from the candle. The fever made Eleonora soft and exacting in the same instant. Her appeal cut with the bluntness of someone who could not imagine that a man might refuse when the price was a daughter's command. "Tomas," she murmured, and in the single sound of her voice were all the ways she had been taught to own, to take, to bargain. Clarice's face tightened in expectation. He held their eyes, one look answering two claims. "I owe you my service," he said at last, and the phrase landed in the room like an inherited phrase of contract. "I have kept to what was asked of me, but I am not your thing to pass between you. I am not a proof for either of you." The words made a small fissure in the walls. Eleonora's breath hitched, equal parts astonishment and shame. Clarice's mouth flattened into the exact geometry of a woman who had been denied the only entitlement she believed legitimate. The doctor, standing by the doorway with his hands folded, asked if there were signs of delirium. The steward murmured about appearances. The capataz said nothing. Tomas rose and left the room, and the house felt as if it had lost a chord. What followed was not a moment of melodramatic departure, but a patient, brutal unspooling. Clarice switched tactics from conquest to coercion. She spoke in half-phrases to visitors, hinted at improprieties, let her laughter ring in company when the conversation grew to expensive things. She pestered the steward with insinuations, building a case in a world where rumor and reputation could be counted as currency. She practiced in public, the gestures of a wronged heiress who had been deprived of what she considered a rightful inheritance. Tomas, meanwhile, did what he had always done. He turned his attention to the survival of his interior world. Survival for him required a plan that could be executed without inviting the brutal corrections of power. He began to move through the plantation in a new rhythm, keeping accounts of small freedoms and opportunities. He spoke in small, careful confidences to an older woman who had worked in the house longer than most, a woman named Rosa, whose hands had the knowledge of stitches and who knew the valuation of secrets. Rosa had the discreet courage of someone who had buried much and spoken little. She listened to Tomas with the sympathy of a life spent translating pain into small possibilities. "You cannot stay long where you are wanted as an answer," she told him one afternoon as they scrubbed a tray together. Her voice was low as the undertow, her eyes were the color of patience. "They will set you before each other until you are nothing but an illustration." Tomas, who had not been given the luxury of many confidants, found in Rosa a mirror. He spoke to her of leaving, of finding a way to be elsewhere where his body might be a worker and not a prize. He spoke of cities he had heard of in conversation, ports where ships took people, and places where hands, if steady, found wages not always held as ransom. The idea of being sold by his owner to a trader who would take him beyond the plantation's geography coalesced into a plan. It required a sum, an agreement, and a moment. There were risks. Being sold might deposit him in a worse place. It might chain him further. But remaining as a disputed private good promised a slow corrosion of all he reserved of dignity. He began with the patience of a man who measures days by the count of small coins hidden in seams, to save. He took on extra tasks with the economy of a person learning how to turn extra labor into a pathway. He bought small favors, exchanged services for goods, listened to the itinerant trader who sometimes came through the nearby town, with a report of ships and ports and captains with short tempers and long routes. Tomas watched, waited, and when an opportunity whispered, he prepared to seize it. The Museum of Housekeeping continued its small cruelties. Eleonora's fevers came again, and with them came moments of lucidity so piercing that those who loved her, or believed they did, were forced into the disorienting light of truth. In one lucid hour she called Clarice to her, and with a hand that had been both tender and possessive, said words that revealed more than a confession. "I have been cruel," she admitted, and Clarice, listening, felt something ancient and animal and ungovernable rise in her chest. For the first time, the daughter tasted the seriousness of the wound she had inflicted by pursuing ownership as if it were a right. But the apology did not undo a pattern. The seed of rivalry had been sown deep. It had taken on a life of its own in the household. Clarice, who had been trained to think in the arithmetic of inheritance, could not relinquish what she had learned to imagine as a claim. She vilified Tomas in the curt privacy of the dining room, making the servants witness to her rhetorical scorn. "He has been taught false humility," she said once, voice sharpened by impatience. "He parades his restraint, and it is only because he knows his place." Tomas heard such remarks, and he turned them inward. He learned to measure them as another climate. Words would come and go, storms would break and then be mended by the practicalities of life. He took care not to answer in kind. Retaliation would feed the machinery that reduced him. Instead, he waited for a moment when he could reclaim his path. The moment came with the kind of suddenness ordinary lives sometimes grant, as if to mock the idea of preparation. A buyer from the city, a man with a ledger and a practiced indifference, arrived with the news that the Baron's successor needed hands ready for transport. The steward received him with the decorum of a household doing business. The capataz hustled men to stand for inspection. Tomas, who had been careful to avoid these public displays, found the buyer's eyes linger on him, because a kind of utility sits in the body of a competent worker. The trader's interest pivoted not on flesh as prize for seduction, but on muscle for commerce. In those ledger eyes, Tomas saw a small window. He seized it. Negotiations of sale are mechanical things, every bit as much as they are moral wounds. The trader spoke numbers like the lasts of a shoemaker. The steward balanced sums like a priest balancing liturgy. Tomas, present for the handshakes and the whispered transfers, let the leather of the transaction pass around him like a rope. He did not ask for freedom in a formal way, for the legal pathways were uncertain in the province. He asked instead for a route away. He made his intent clear in a manner that did not humiliate, but reclaimed a sliver of authority. He requested to be the subject of the sale, if that was the price to be paid, to leave a house that had taught others to think of him as something to be parceled. It was a small rebellion couched in the syntax of submission, ask to be sold, and in the buying you would be taken out of the theatre. When the steward, surprised, questioned the propriety of such a request, Thomas answered with the simple syllables of sorrow and calculation. "I choose where I will not be the object of a duel," he said. "If leaving is measured by coin, let the coin be paid so that I might go." The household exploded into a dozen utterances. Eleonora woke from a nap by the talk, clutched at her sheets and accused herself in whispers. Clarice, mortified, demanded that the sale be stopped, or that if a sale must occur, it be to someone worse. Better, she thought, that he be destroyed than that he slip clean from their reach. It was then, in a room humming with a moral argument that had the quality of a parish dispute, that Thomas took his dignity and placed it on the table. "I will go," he said. "I will not let myself be taken as a prize. If the law or the men of the town require this manner to make me leave, then let it be so. But know that I do not go because I am given. I go because I choose my absence rather than be bartered as a fighting piece between those I tend." His voice was steady. It carried the authority of someone who had been trained to weigh outcomes. The trader smiled like a man whose trade depended on the clarity of a bargain, and the steward made notes. The capataz, who had lived by the practicalities of keeping a plantation moving, shrugged as if to say that people left, and men were moved like furniture when circumstances required. Eleonora, seeing that the hands she had thought to hold were slipping into the ledger of exchange, felt a profound and dizzying panic. She vowed in the fevered hours that she would not be the cause of his leaving for the sake of spectacle. But Clarice was different. She saw in the captivity of Thomas the last treasure of a household that could still enact absolute dominion. Losing him without the spectacle of victory would have seemed to her a private humiliation. She moved from sabotage to a darker plan. If she could not have his consent, she would manufacture a cause. She began to leave notes, to plant doubts about his loyalties in the ears of neighbors, to insinuate that he had stolen or conspired with men of the field, or held improper thoughts that the town might find scandalous. It was petty cruelty in a gilded form, and in its smallness it had an immediate pain. Thomas, who watched the moves as an observer of weather, did not answer the insinuations with violence. He instead sealed his preparations. On a prearranged morning when the mist hung low and the coffee trees looked like a blur of grey, the buyer arrived with his men and his ledgers. Thomas walked to the yard with his bundle of provisions, a small bag of clothes, an old pendant his mother had given him, a paper with a few names he would commit to memory. He said his goodbyes in ways that almost disguised their grief, a short nod to Rosa, a last curt handshake with the capataz, an even quieter look at the house itself, as if cataloguing the thresholds where his life had been organized. Eleonora, fever-laden and at once aghast and bruised, called him to her. The house gathered as if to watch a death. "Stay for me," she begged, in the blunt way power teaches people to speak when they cannot command. "Stay, and do not be a thing I have to remember in fragments." He took her hand, that small, steady contact one last time, and in it there was the history of nights and the scale of having to bow. "I will not be your possession," he said. "I will not be proof of your survival. I will go, so that I may not be the prize." Clarice watched and felt the ground shift. She reached for him and begged, not with a daughterly softness but with an entitlement that had the sharpness of someone who had never been rebuked by consequence. "Take me with you," she said once, an implausible, dangerous wish, as if the world were a basket to be lifted and placed. Thomas looked at her with something like pity. He could have spoken the words that would have justified the husband's or the mistress's illusions. He could have placated or deceived, but he had come to a new resolve. "No," he said, "I will not be the answer to your appetite. My leaving must be mine, must be—" He climbed into the trader's cart. The house watched him go through the long gate, past the yard where children had once played, and men had once sung, past the stables and the mill, past the jasmine and the waxed floor that reflected patience. For Eleonora there was a small violent breakdown, an unbound moan that startled even the most seasoned. For Clarice there was a cold blankness, the sort that arrives in a person who thinks they have been cheated of rightful property. For the others there was a practical rearrangement, a shift in daily assignments, a small closing of ranks around the gone. Tomas's departure, when it occurred, was not triumphant. It carried the melancholy dignity of someone who understood that leaving is rarely triumphant. The trader took the ledger and wrote a new line. Men were shifted. The household paid the price it would always pay for secrets made public, a slow corrosion of cohesion, conversations that no longer ran true. Once he was gone, Santa Vitória contracted inward like a living thing that had been pricked. Eleonora's fever ebbed and returned in cycles, each more damaging than the last. Her lucidity, regained in brief moments, was sharp with self-reproach. In those lucid intervals, she summoned the steward and instructed him, with the disordered resolve of someone who would mend what she had rent, to set aside funds to purchase freedom for a few who had no voice in the accounting of conscience. She could not undo what had been done, but she could, with money and the will to make a small restitution, arrange that a handful of lives might be unbound. It was a late atonement, and atonement does not wash clean. It only sows the seeds of a quieter justice. The steward, who had watched Eleonora's private acts with the same mixture of respect and irritation he felt for misplaced generosity, did as he was told. He made arrangements in the shadowy foolishness of a man who had always read the accounts as absolute truth. He found traders and men willing to take coins and in return sign the papers that would grant certain people the legal recognition of freedom. The work was mundane and bureaucratic and full of the strange intimacy of people meeting at the edge of law to buy what had been stolen. Names were exchanged, hands were given, papers were signed. The newly freed left not in triumphant parades, but in small, practical departures. A woman who had kept the children of the house found a cousin in town and walked away with a small chest of linens. A young man who had been apprenticed as a cooper left with a cart of tools. Eleonora watched these things from her bedside with a mixture of relief and a deeper despair. Relief that she could do something, despair that any money could balance a life. Tomas, meanwhile, found himself in a larger world than the plantation. The trader had, true to the commerce of movement, delivered him to a port where ships left for other cities and places. For a time he worked as he had been trained. He repaired sails, he handled cargo, he learned to lift and load with a new economy. He slept in lodgings that smelt of salt and coal, with men who had been uprooted for many reasons, and who found in the port a kind of anonymity that was not eradication, but a new arrangement of life. He met people whose vocabulary included the word freedom in ways the plantation had not taught him. Some used it as a dream, others a practical tool. He took small, honest jobs, and more importantly, he practiced something he had not been permitted to before. He practiced being the author of his own days. In a letter he would send years later, a short, neat paper, the edges browned by travel and a life kept modest, he wrote not of exotic adventures, but of quiet things. "I chose to leave," he wrote, and in the sentence there was no triumph, only the precise articulation of a reclaimed agency. Freedom is not only a paper, it is wakefulness. It is not measured only in coins, but in the hours you may refuse to be an answer to someone else's hunger. He told Rosa that he had found work in a dock, and that he had not sought to buy his freedom by the standards of law. Instead, he had purchased it, in a sense, by building a life that required him to answer only to those he chose to serve for wages, and to the man he wanted to be. Eleonora's death was as soft and heavy as the house's blinds. It came in a small morning, when the air outside was humid and thick with the smell of coffee drying. The doctor rode in and checked her pulse, and with a look that enclosed compassion and disinterest, pronounced that her heart had at last given way to the slow dieting of the years of grief. In her last week she asked for Tomas by name once more, and when the news of his departure reached her bedside, she wept not for the loss of a favourite, but for the discovery of the cruelty of what she had thought was consolation. "I loved him crookedly," she whispered to the steward, who stood with the awkwardness of someone bearing a finance to atonement. I loved him as if love could be bound. I have been a thief of people and of myself. Her last acts were not grand. They were absences filled by the awareness of damage and the attempt, however late and inadequate, to make small reparations. Clarice inherited a house that had the silence of things that shelter memories, as if they were dust. She kept rooms closed. She married briefly to a man with proper connections, but no real tenderness. That marriage would not last in the way society predicted. It dissolved into long silences and mutual tolerances, a social dissolving where neither spouse dared to speak names that might be poisonous. Clarice sold Santa Vitória, the steward who oversaw the sale remarking on her pale face and the slight tremor that would not be explained by the weather. She moved to the city, as many of the gentry do when illusions crack. There, in the noise of streets that did not measure her by dowries but by narrower things, she found new people and a kind of anonymity that both relieved and punished her. Years later, in a hotel room that looked over a street with trams and the distant dim of a theatre sign, Clarice kept a small drawer of items she could not bring herself to destroy, a scrap of Tomas's shirt folded as if the cloth could be folded back into memory, an old letter she had never read aloud, a lock of hair tied with a ribbon she had once worn. She would look at these things and find the outline of a life she might have had, and the regret was not dramatic, so much as a dull, ongoing ache that undercut the shape of her days. She gave away some objects in a fit of penitent generosity, and kept one thing hidden, not to nourish memory but to prove to herself that something had been real. Tomas's letter, when it arrived years later, sent by a sailor who had known him and who had wished to pass forward a message, did not offer the melodrama of revenge or confession. It was spare and precise. "I am alive," he wrote. "I have made for myself a daily ledger of work and of small sorrows. I have not come to say I am forgiven, because I do not assume such things. I have come to say I am living. That is for me the closest thing to freedom I could purchase." He spoke of a song he had learned from a woman at the port, of the taste of bread he could afford, of the strange, steady courtesies of men in new trades. He told Rosa to mind herself, and sent money enough for a chest of linens and a small weighing machine so she might set up a stall if she desired. The letter closed with a short, almost cynical line, "Tell them I went seeking not an answer, but an exit." The house at Santa Vitória did not survive forever. Time took its toll, and so did the modernities that change landscapes. Where once the waxed floors shone with the patience of propriety, craftsmen and new uses altered the rooms. The house, which had once kept its curtains drawn as if to hide a shame, was eventually purchased by a developer who liked the sound of the land more than the memory. He flattened the galleries, sold the tiles, and built a hotel whose windows now open wide and show nothing of the old boundaries. Locals, when they pass beneath the hotel awning, sometimes say they can feel the old house's echo on certain stormy nights. A door that does not quite close, the distant hint of jasmine, the echo of a man's steps when the rain is heavy. The narrator, looking back on the spiral of desires and claims, sees in that ruin a parable not only of particular people, but of a broader human tendency. Possession wears the guise of protection and then proves its true face, hunger. To possess another is to set in motion a series of claims and countermands that eat at the possessor as much as at the possessed. Eleonora wanted warmth and found herself taught to own. Clarice wanted to inherit a private triumph and became, in the process, a new form of predator. Tomas wanted to be himself and was forced to convert that desire into a plan for leaving. Each acted within roles given by a society that measured men and women by things and by lines of descent, not by the subjectivity of their hearts. There is cruelty enough in history to drown an account of any single heart. The particular cruelty here is domestic and intimate, the intimacy of a house where the people closest to one another became competitors for a human life. The plantation's social codes created a space where desire could be redirected into possession, where hunger could be framed as a moral right. When the house sought to settle the matter by the simple ledger of sale, Tomas chose a path that was not merely self-preservation, but a kind of ethical clarity. He would not be a spectacle. He chose, as his small revolt, to remove himself from a system that wanted to define him by other people's hunger. What remains after such unquiet events are not clean lessons, but fragments. A woman who discovers too late that her consolation was a cruelty. A daughter who finds her brief victory a leper's prize. A man who leaves and in leaving composes for himself a life that no ledger acknowledges. There is a final, meager justice in Eleonora's attempt to buy freedom for others, and in the steward's doing of her bidding, but atonement is often only partial. Money can alter legal ties, but cannot erase the intimacy of wounds. If there is a single image that will haunt Santa Vitória, it is that of thresholds. Doors are where decisions are made, where a hand presses a latch and chooses what enters the room and what remains outside. Tomás walked through such a door and stepped into a wider, duller world, carrying with him the knowledge that the only way to refuse being a prize is to choose absence. Eleonora pressed her hand against a shutter and felt the draught of a world that had been richer and crueler than she had understood. Clarice moved across thresholds outward, into a city that gave her amenities, but not the capacity for the tender restraint her mother had learned late. At the end, the moral is neither a sermon nor a consolation. It is a caution. Desire that seeks to possess will become a force that strips the desirers of their humanity as surely as it strips the desired of theirs. Love that does not liberate is not love. It is a trade that leaves debts unpaid and people diminished. What one must take from such a house is not merely pity for a fallen mistress or sympathy for a fleeing worker, but the vigilance to notice how our small appetites can become, over time, the architecture of others' suffering. If these words find you on the other side of their telling, consider the thresholds in your own life. Who you have thought you could own, who you have set as an answer, who you have allowed to be reduced for the sake of your comfort. Try to measure your desires by whether they free or bind. The house that was Santa Vitória, with its waxing floors and jasmine that pressed into seams, is gone. The hotel that replaced it is indifferent. What lingers is the lesson. To claim another is to make a prisoner of both. If you saw in this narrative the shape of someone you know, speak of it. Share your impressions and ask, who in the lives we touch are we threatening to make trophies? Who are we saving by letting go? If you found this story compelling, and you want more tales that unfold the darker corners of history, consider subscribing for further dramas that examine the costs of desire. And if this narrative unsettled you, leave a comment. Who was truly to blame, and who, if anyone, could have loved differently?